Human society is relentlessly buffeted by a never-ending deluge of social movements. These movements spring up again and again. And when they are successful, they alter the course of history. I'm here to tell you that most social movements aren't really such a good idea. The reason these movements pop up so frequently is that our social cognition is systematically biased towards the supporters of social movements and against their critics. This means that we invest more time, energy, money, and even blood into these movements than they really deserve. In this speech, I'm going to use Scientology as an example to illustrate my point. Scientology is a particularly vivid example, but there are many other phenomena you could view through this framework. We could talk about diet fads, cryptocurrency, tech companies, productivity tools, many other things. Now, to start, I want you to imagine a world where people took seriously the problem of evaluating social movements. What we would do in this world is, for each movement, have a debate, and the promoters and the critics of the movement would come together and present their best arguments and their best evidence. Each statement would be responded to by the other side. Perhaps there'd be a moderator who would make sure that the proceedings followed a set of rules. And at the end of the debate, the audience would weigh all of the evidence and decide for itself whether or not the social movement was a good idea. Now, that is not what happens in our world. Our world is a free-for-all. People go on television, people bribe politicians, they advertise, they use social media, they write yellow journalism, they write good journalism. All of these things are competing with each other. All manners of schemes and tricks and persuasion is used to convince people. Now, not only is this the Wild West in terms of evaluating ideas, this world is systematically biased in favor of the supporters of social movements and against the critics. That's what I'm going to talk about in this speech. There's three factors. The first factor is about organization. Social movements very often become organized by creating churches or schools or nonprofits or companies. And these institutions bring together the supporters, they raise money, and they coordinate the activities of the promoters. A good example is the Church of Scientology, which eventually became large and quite well-funded. On the other hand, the critics of the social movement rarely become organized. There is no organization dedicated to convincing people that Scientology is a bad idea. The critics have compelling evidence and arguments, but they have seriously difficulty in coordinating their actions. They tend to remain leaderless and isolated. To use a musical analogy, the supporters of a movement, their voices are combined to form a symphony, while the voices of the critics remain a cacophony. The next factor is an asymmetry of incentive. To put it simply, the promoters of a social movement have much more to gain from the success of the movement than the critics have to gain from the failure of the movement. If the movement succeeds, the promoters become wealthy or famous. Here we have L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, made a lot of money promoting the religion, in part by forcing his followers to buy his books. On the other side, we have David Miscavige, who is hanging out with Tom Cruise. Obviously, these men became wealthy and successful through Scientology. Now, on the other hand, the critics made very little money. They had very little to gain from their work. Maybe they sold some books. Maybe they made a documentary that got some viewership. But overall, they didn't benefit very much. They were mostly motivated by altruism. They wanted to prevent other people from suffering what they experienced within the church. So the promoters have a much greater incentive to succeed, which means they're going to put tons of energy and time into promoting this movement, whereas the critics are going to write their book or write their documentary and then move on to the next project. And there's one final factor, which is an asymmetry of identity. If you are a Scientologist, that becomes part of your identity, and that influences the way you act. You're probably going to talk about Scientology with your friends. You might convince them that Scientology has benefited your career or improved your mental health. Maybe you try to convince your family members to come to a Scientology service and see what it's all about. On the other hand, if you're not a Scientologist, you probably don't go around trying to convince people that Scientology is a bad idea. You don't distribute books critical of Scientology to your friends. The fact that you are not a Scientologist simply does not register as part of your identity. It's not something you think about. Friends, human history is littered with examples of social movements that grew far out of proportion to the quality of the underlying ideas. This is because our social cognition is systematically biased in favor of the promoters and against the critics of social movements. The promoters have a much greater incentive to succeed. The efforts of the promoters are coordinated by organizations and companies, while the critics remain leaderless and isolated. And finally, supporters of social movements embrace the movement as part of their identity, while critics do not. I hope my advice will help you to avoid falling into the trap of a misguided social movement.